Awa, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Me tīmata tātou mā te karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai, e hia ki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei, Māori ora. Awa tēnā, ko te mihi tuatahi ki tō tātou matua nui i te rangi, anāna nei ngā mea katoa. E mihi atu ana ki a rātou mā, kua wehe atu ki te pō, haere, haere, rātou te hunga mate ki a rātou, a tātou te hunga ora, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko te mihi anō ki te tangata whenua o tēnei wāhi o te whanganui a Tara, kia Taranaki Whānui, kia te Atiawa, tēnā koutou e manaaki nei i a tātou i rungi i o koutou whenua i tēnei rā. Hoi anō, ko te tino mihi atu ki a tātou katoa, e raurika mai nei ki runga i tēnei kaupapa. Ka nui te mihi atu ki a koutou e whakarongo mai nā i o koutou tari, i o koutou kāinga, i hea atu. Tino hari koa taku ngākau ki te mihi atu ki a koutou, whakatau mai, nau mai ki tēnei te wiki o te matatapu. Ka nui te mihi atu ki a koutou e whakarongo mai nā. Hoi anō, ko te tino mihi atu ki ngā kai kōrero i tēnei rā. Ka huri atu au ki a Chris Cormack no Tahu, no Kāti Māmoe, ki a Ernestynne Walsh no Ngāti Porou, no te Whānau-a-Apanui. Hoi anō, ka waiho au ki a Arawa, mā Arawa e whakamohio atu ki a koutou ko wai Arawa. Hoi anō, kāre toro ake ngā mihi, no reira, kei te mihi, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. Chris.
Kia ora tātou. Iri hau o kai tahu rātou ko Kāti Māmoe ko Waitaha hoki. Māmoe raki hau i ngari whānau i kawakau i te nota. Tuku mai au i whanganui e noa anau ki whanganui a Tara i ngā anei. Ko te ingoa o taku mahi he kaihua waire matahiko ki te roku catalyst. He mahi anō he mawhitiwhiti rorohiko ki te kākahu o Henira Ranga ki te kahura. So, my name is Chris Cormack. I'm from Moiraki, down in the Te Waipounamu, but I was born up in Kolokoa in the Northland and went to high school in Whanganui and lived down here now, slowly getting closer to home. Got stuck at the Cook Strait, but I'll get across here sometime, return home. I have two roles. I work at Catalyst IT here in Wellington, on Willis Street there, and my role there is Kaihua Waire Matahiko, and it's a role to try and make Catalyst a better place for Māori to work at and a better place for Māori and Māori organisations to work with. And I also have a role at Te Kāhuriranga, which is under the Data ILG, under the iwi Chair Forum, and I'm a digital technician there. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Chris. Ernestynne.
Kia ora. Ai, ko ai he wiwi Ngāti, he mani te Māmoe-Apanui, ko Ernestynne Walsh tōku ingoa, kei Pōneke no Whānau, e mahi anō ki Nicholson Consulting, he pau arahi raronga Māori. E katahi anō ka motu I taku tohu pairua, ara ko te Master of Māori and Indigenous Leadership. So, kia ora, my name's Ernestynne from the East Coast Bay of Plenty area, but I grew up here in Pōneke, Wellington. I work at Nicholson Consulting as the Māori Data Service Lead, and I just finished my Masters of Māori and Indigenous Leadership. And that kaupapa was in implementing Māori Data Sovereignty in the public service. So, kia ora.
Well, kia ora kōrua, nau mai haere mai, and ko Shane Heremaia hau ko te pauarahi kei te Office of the Privacy Commissioner nei. So welcome everybody, it's my pleasure to welcome you to OPC's Privacy Week. It's great to have you here, thank you for joining in. We've got some great speakers here for you today, talking about Māori data sovereignty as being too hard. So this may be a view that some people have, but we're here to dispel that myth today. So we've got 2 talks from our 2 speakers here, and then we'll have some time for questions. If you look where you logged in to Zoom, if you can't see where you put your questions, there is a button there down the bottom that says Q&A. So if you go and press the Q&A button, then you can pop your questions in, pop them in early so that we can have a look at them before we get to them later on in the presentation. But I want to leave as much time to our guests today to tell us what they're talking about. So I'll pass us back to Chris. Kia ora.
Kia ora, koutou. I'm just going to share my screen now. Hopefully this works. Did before, but you never know. Okay, we'll skip over this slide because I've already said who I am, but that's me at Waitangi in 1976 with Toki Pū. I just do a bit of a disclaimer. So I'm part of Te Manaraunga, which, as it says there, is a network of people advocating for Māori rights and interests in data. I don't represent them, but we are people who share a kaupapa, and I'm not speaking on behalf of either of my employees either. So what I normally say is if you like it, then it was Catalyst, Te Kahuraunga and Te Manaraunga. If you didn't like it, it was Chris Cormack. So just do it that way. So I'm going to do this really fast because we've got a short period of time, but I'm going to talk more about the case for Māori data sovereignty, why it's important, and then I think Ernestynne is going to talk more about some examples of doing it right. So hopefully they complement. We haven't had a chance to practice or anything, so we're seeing our dress rehearsal live. It's opening night, as they would say. So really brief history lesson. We'll start in 1835 with He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, which was signed up in Waitangi. Well, not actually Waitangi, but close to Waitangi. And it was the scene that set the scene for Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And so there's a nice quote there from Vincent O'Malley, Dr. Vincent O'Malley, that was at that point it had been acknowledged to be a sovereign land under the authority of Māori tribes before 1840, which is what makes Te Tiriti kind of unique with some of the treaties signed around the world with the English crown. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi, first signed in Feb 6, 1840. I hope you all know this, but it was almost all signatories on the Māori version, as Margaret Muti would say, on the actual version, and the English version was the draft. But even if there were 2 versions, under the contract rule, and any ambiguity, the side that drafted the treaty is the one that has to take the loss, for example. So in this case, because the Crown drafted the treaty, then the Māori version is their sovereign, which means Māori ceded kawanatanga to Pāngia, not rangatiratanga. So quite a difference. So I'm making the case for sovereignty here. Then if we come forward to November 24, the Waitangi Tribunal found again that Ngāpuhi and therefore Māori had never ceded sovereignty. I will make these slides available afterwards as well, so people don't have to read all these, because I'm conscious we have 15 minutes each, so I don't want to make you read too much. There are some other interesting tribunal findings. So Y2522, which is the one that came out of the TPPA CTTP negotiations, and it found that the Crown had breached Te Tiriti, and then one of the interesting findings there is that Māori data is a taonga, and that Māori have sovereignty over Māori data. 2575, which is the one that established the now de-established Māori Health Authority, which is a shocking state of affairs, but enough on that one. It reinforced that Māori data had sovereignty again. Māori had sovereignty over their data again, over our data, I should say, in this inquiry. So data sovereignty, a really narrow definition is it comes into play when an organisation's data is stored outside of their country and is subject to the laws of the country in which the data resides. So you think of Most of our government data is either in Azure or Amazon, usually in Australia. So it's under Australian laws as well as New Zealand laws, and because of the Cloud Act, under US laws as well. So that it makes it harder to assert sovereignty. So, but I'm talking more about the ability to exert control over where the data is stored, how it's used, and who it is used by. So I'm starting wide and trying to narrow down to Māori data sovereignty. So Indigenous data sovereignty is concerned with the rights of Indigenous people to control data derived from and pertaining to them and their knowledge systems, customs, or territories. If we drill, so that's Māori data sovereignty too. If we drill down a little bit more, we can also say Māori data sovereignty supports a collective sovereign refusal that is both a shutting down of data colonialism and a simultaneous opening up of an alternative relational approach to data and digital technologies that is grounded in tikanga. I like using that quote because I once wrote a chapter in a book and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. And if you're going to write a chapter, you can at least get to quote yourself every so often. So that's why I put that in there. But I do like that it's not just a shutting down of the way data is being looked after now. It's more of a opening up of a different approach. So what is Māori data? Māori data refers to digital or digitizable information or knowledge that is about or from Māori people, our languages, cultures, resources, or environments. So it's quite, if you look at that definition, it's not a big leap to say that almost all data generated from or in Aotearoa will have some component of Māori data in it, because it will be off our whenua, or about our whenua, or about us, or those kind of things. So it's a lot. So so yeah, if you think about that, this kind of, if we get privacy and sovereignty and control and tikanga and kaitiakitanga right for Māori data, it flows on and gets it right for almost all of our data too. So there's an old adage, what's good for Māori is what's good for everyone, and I think this applies under Māori data sovereignty. So I'm going to talk a brief bit about Te Manararonga, which was kind of the pioneer in this space about 10 to 15 years ago now. And it was a group started out of Māori health researchers mainly, because health researchers always had kind of a slightly better idea around ethics and privacy and stuff than some other of the sciences and social sciences. So they spotted this need that there was no kind of consideration given to how Māori data was stored and looked after and used. So it was formed as an advocacy network to assert Māori rights and data, Māori rights and interests in relation to data, and to ensure that data can be safeguarded and protected. Te Manararonga still exists and is still busy, but it's a voluntary network, and so people get to things when they can, when they don't have, well, they've all got day jobs as well. But what they did do, which is something that is flowed through to kind of all the work following after from the Te Manararonga, and even across to things like the care and the fair principles in North America and some of the other ones, as they developed these 6 principles of Māori data sovereignty. So we have rangatiratanga, whakapapa, whanaungatanga, kotahitanga, manakitanga, and kaitiakitanga in the English translations along the right-hand side. There is a link to this full PDF and the slides. As I said, I'll make those available to everyone somehow afterwards. I'm sure there's a link to all the people who've registered. So I won't go through all of these in much detail, because you can read through them yourself. But the one I'm interested in, my background is IT. I've been doing designing and building databases and data stores and stuff since 1997. So I'm really interested in this kind of area, which is around the control, the jurisdiction, and the self-determination. So this is kind of where your data is stored, the access controls you build around it, and the way it's used. But those principles also cover things like whakapapa. In Te Ao Māori context is massively important, and data has whakapapa, just like rocks, for instance, which is this whakapapa here showing. But everything has whakapapa, everything comes from somewhere, it's going to somewhere. In the archive as well, they call it provenance. Knowing that whakapapa of your data is hugely important too. Whānau-a-Apanui is about accountabilities, kind of when you're using the data that it's helping everyone involved, not just yourselves, and balancing those rights. And yeah, you're accountable for how you use the data. Kotahitanga, this is one that Shane and I were talking about a little bit earlier. It's about the need for building capacity. That's a massive amount of work in Te Ao Māori at the moment. If we were to realise our aims of achieving more data sovereignty, we were to have data repatriated, we'd need the tools to look after it, to analyse it, to build from it, and to derive value from it. Manaakitanga, respect and consent, and kaitiakitanga, this is kind of the guardianship ethics and restrictions. So there's the 6 principles. They're all really simple. And when you read the PDF, you'll be like, this isn't that hard. And that's what I'm hoping that we'll get to at the end of this thing. From that grew the Māori Data Governance model out of Te Kāhuriraunga, who I work for as well. And this is more about looking after Māori data when it's not your stuff. So this was written with co-design between Te Kāhuriraunga and DIA and Statistics New Zealand. Te Kāhuriraunga has a Māmoe agreement between those 2 Māmoe agreements, which means we can operate at that CE level. And that was co-design. And this is more about, so if you think of Māori data sovereignty as Māori having sovereignty over their data, the Crown obviously can't do that. So but what they could do is governance, or what non-Māori organisations can do is good governance of Māori data. So I'll just look at a couple of slides of this. Again, sorry, that link there will take you to the PDF, which it's about 74 pages, and it's a really good thing for, it's almost a recipe book for looking, well, not quite, but it gives you a really good guide for how to look after Māori data. So it's built on these 8 po. I don't know if you can see that slide so well there, but you'll be able to see it better in the PDF. But the main values are: we nurture data as a taonga, be accountable, use data for good, decolonise the data ecosystems, and put iwi Māori data in Māori hands. And so Māori authority over Māori data is kind of where we're trying to get to. So there's kind of 8 po around this. So the first one is data capacities and workforce development. The second one is infrastructure. The third one is data collection. 4th is data protection. 5th is data access, sharing, and repatriation. 6th is data use and reuse. And the 7th is data quality and integrity. And underneath them all, as the whenua that the po stand in, is data classification. So we need to be able to classify what is Māori data, potentially what risks or benefits are associated with it, and therefore know how it should be stored or used as well. So the values are expressed in English to avoid confusion. Like words like kaitiakitanga are great, but they're very encompassing and quite hard to translate into English without using an entire thesis about them. So we did do them in English because then it's much clearer, I think. And so each of the values make an important contribution to the model, and they're intended to work together to drive to achieve the overarching vision. So tuia te korowai o haneranga, so data for self-determination. That's the only one I have it there. So one of the last bits I'll leave, and then I think I'll hand over to Ernestynne, is just a little bit around why is people having control of their data important? Even if we didn't have sovereignty, why we should still give people authority over their own data. And most of you, I guess, if you are interested in privacy, will have known this. This was something that came out of when Bill English was Prime Minister, this thankfully didn't get made, but this was a investment approach that was getting traction, and the idea was that they would build models built on the integrated data infrastructure, which is the big integrated thing at Statistics New Zealand, which has the census data, but it has also a whole lot of administrative data from the government, plus some other things, and they were going to use this to basically build the Minority Report. So the idea, if you've seen that movie, is to predict who would offend and then intervene in early to stop offences. So this is I think hopefully you agree with me, a horrible idea, but this is kind of what happens if you lose control over your data. It can get used against you in nasty ways. And another simple one is that often stories of Māori are told through the lens of deprivation and those kind of always kind of 50% of the population, present population of Māori and stuff like that. If you have control over your own data, or at least you can choose to, you can tell different stories with that exact same data. And there's a platform called Te Whata, tewhata.io, which tells those kind of stories as well. I think that's probably all I wanted to say for now. I'm going to pass over to Ernestynne.
Sure. Well, kia ora, Chris. I think you've set a good foundation for people. This is an introductory session into Māori data sovereignty. But so feel free to ask any questions. We've left aside quite a bit of time for questions. And so Chris will be able to extend on anything that you might want to explore soon. Otherwise, I'm going to pass over to Ernestynne, and she's got, oh, yep, you can see the presentation up there. So, kia ora, tūhine.
Tēnā koe e te rangatira. Tuatahi kanui te mihi ki a koe e te ringarehe. Mau e raranga hei whāriki, o tēnei whāriki hei wāhi akoranga kia noho tahi ai tātou. So tēnā te mihi ki a koe. Just wanted to acknowledge Chris there. He's created, what I was saying is he's woven together this mat or this space of learning for us to all come together today as one to learn about Māori data sovereignty. So just wanted to acknowledge the kōrero because I'm going to build on top of what he's spoken about today. And so what I want to do first, once I figure out how to move to the next slide, is just give a bit of an overview of where I fit in with the mahi that Chris has described. So I mentioned that I work at Nicholson Consulting. We're a multidisciplinary data science company in Porou, and our vision is to create a more equitable Aotearoa. And so for us, that means addressing power imbalances, such as the raru ki tai that you described, so that everyone has the opportunities to thrive. And so we do this through three different service areas. We've got our core data science offering, we've got research and insights, and then we've got a Māori data team that I look after. And so a lot of the mahi we do in that space is either Māori data science, such as our Te Reo Māori revitalisation mahi, but another big chunk of the mahi is a lot of people ask us about Māori data sovereignty implementation and Māori data governance. And want to acknowledge all the rōpū that Chris has mentioned that have really created this kaupapa and really driven it around Māori data sovereignty. And I think through the private sector as well, whether it's Chris at Catalyst with the IT pōtai, one of his many pōtai that he wears, or one of the pōtai I wear in the data space, also in the private sector. I think we can all work together to help elevate this kaupapa, and I think you guys can help as well. I mentioned that I have a master's degree, but I want to assure you that you don't need a master's degree in Māori data sovereignty to be able to put it into practice. So I do need to acknowledge the team though. Whilst it's me here presenting today, I wouldn't have grown as much without the support of my team with the fantastic whakaaro that they share. So we all learn from each other. And at the moment, we've got a few Māori people. We've got a few kapahaka victors in the mix as well. So it meant that today I'm the one presenting, but just also wanted to acknowledge the team. So Chris talked and gave an overview of the Māori Data Sovereignty principles. And so what I want to do, as Chris mentioned earlier, is build upon this by having some examples, because I often feel that through examples, it makes things that may come across as abstract more tangible. And with the time I've got available, I certainly won't be able to go through all of these. We do like half-day trainings on this kaupapa alone. So I'm just going to go through a few different examples just as a taster, and hopefully that will help lift the veil, so to speak, and lift that fog so that it's a bit clearer that Māori data sovereignty isn't too hard. You just need the right examples to make it real. And so I want to cover 3 core examples and then do a wrap up on where you can find more information outside of this talk. And so the 3 examples I'm going to look at is one that was covered earlier last week around Māori algorithmic sovereignty. I want to look at examples of legal cases that might help strengthen some of your understanding around Māori data and how Māori data sovereignty relates, particularly in the privacy space. And then I had an interesting one because we often get pātai or questions around individual versus collective privacy. And so I thought I might just give an example of one project we did that involved consent forms and thinking about those dynamics. And then to wrap up, I'll just show you a campaign that we worked on last month that just has some more information if you want to find out more. Okay, so first up, Māori algorithmic sovereignty. So relatively new term, and it builds on top of the existing Māori data sovereignty principles. And the reason it builds on top of them is because algorithms are a very specific use case when it comes to using Māori data. And so there's just a couple more things that you may want to make more explicit when you're thinking about using Māori data in an algorithm context. And so it's a little hard to see, but believe me when I say those principles that Chris spoke about and the ones I just showed before are in that screenshot. And one of the principles talks about manaakitanga. For those who are familiar with the Māori data sovereignty principles, you will notice that there's a few different things in manaakitanga this time around because we're looking at an algorithm. And one of those things I really want to highlight is that privacy now is something that's explicitly called out under that manaakitanga category. And so I think this is particularly interesting given it's Privacy Week. And I'll go into a bit more detail about how that process was fleshed out. But just for a bit of horopaki or context, this mahi is through the Tikanga and Technology project. And there's a few different research aims it has, but this specific research aim is about decolonising algorithms. And so at Nicholson Consulting, this mahi is led by our service lead in research and insights, Ben Ritchie, who's also Tahu Kāti Māmoe as well. And he's been leading our team on the Nicholson Consulting side to help test this framework. And so what we've been looking at, because with our data science area, we often look at operational algorithms as well, and sometimes we get asked to review them, is we looked at this framework and we developed a range of questions to help test out what does it mean to demonstrate manaakitanga from a privacy concept when you're looking at Māori algorithmic sovereignty. So each one of those sub-principles, there's questions to help develop out and flesh out your understanding of Māori algorithmic sovereignty and what sort of elements you should be looking at. And so the team at Nicholson Consulting reviewed one of the operational algorithms in the governance space, and we worked through some of those questions. It's an interesting process, but before I jump to that next one, I'll just wrap up and say that what makes it interesting is some of the key takeaways from that work and from working through that process is we reviewed an algorithm that's already operational. So ideally what you'd want to do is ask those sorts of questions before you even start implementing the algorithm. And one of the weirdo that was put out there by my Hoamahi Ben as well was, if you're already in flight and there are serious red flags being raised, are you going to change them and address them? And if it's something so extreme, would you consider stopping implementing the algorithm? And those are some really hard questions to ask once you're in the middle of a project. But as Ben says, they're the hard ones that need asking sometimes. And so I mentioned that this is a recent piece of mahi. And so last week, Ben and a few others on the Tikanga and Technology project presented a Whāki webinar. And they were looking at covering this work in more detail, and they've also produced a journal article as well, which speaks to Māori algorithmic sovereignty. And so I think if that's something that interests you, if you're working with algorithms and you want to learn more about how you could apply this framework from a privacy lens, but also more broadly when it comes to operational algorithms, definitely check out that link below that screenshot, and I think I'll also have to put it in the chat as well, because that's very hard to read. But that is the first example that I wanted to cover. The second example that I wanted to look at is learning through practical examples. And I think learning by an example is a good way to help demystify Māori data sovereignty. And so at Nicholson Consulting, we spent 12 months going through internal wānanga, having a wānanga each month to help us just internally sharpen the tools in our kete and get us thinking more about some of the topics that are coming up in this space. And so one of the topics was on Māori data and privacy. And we worked through several legal cases to understand what are some learnings we can take away. And I think one of the most well-known ones, which I guess also extends on to my 2575 that Chris mentioned, is the case around Te Pou Matakana versus Attorney General. And so this one's particularly interesting because it talks, as the picture shows there, you can see the little COVID QR scan codes. But this particular case was about accessing Māori data to inform COVID vaccination responses. And I think it's an interesting one because we don't have a te tiriti clause in our privacy statement, but you can see that there are things that can be lent on, such as public benefit or the need to reduce, particularly in this example, risks in the house space. So it is possible to work through Māori data considerations around collective benefit and also thinking about privacy as well. So definitely a legal case that I recommend you look at. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner has done a commentary on this case, and the Tikanga Technology project that I just mentioned before has another research aim as well, which is around Māori data and privacy, and they also did an analysis of Te Pou Matakana. So definitely encourage you to read more if you're wanting to know about Māori data and privacy, particularly in the health space. And I think if you can form a group of people to have a discussion with, particularly if that group has a range of different skills, that's when you start to learn more about the different facets of Māori data. And so for me, one of the favourite cases that we looked at was actually the Pōkere case. And it's not necessarily a Māori data case, but it talks a lot around tikanga and how tikanga can be applied in a legal context. And so having our our po-whanake talk about tikanga and customary practices and getting us thinking about what might that look like in a Māori data space really started to broaden our whakaaro in this space. So if you can, find some buddies as well, particularly if they're not working in the same sort of area as you, that will really help broaden your knowledge in the space. And then the final example I wanted to cover was looking at collective versus individual considerations. And I mentioned earlier, people often ask us about collective privacy versus individual privacy. And so it is an interesting one to think about. And so there was a piece of work that we did with one particular client, which was in the consultation space. And so they needed to go out and capture whakaaro or thoughts to inform the consultation that they were working through. And what was interesting about that was in the consultation, you could be speaking, as Chris said, hey, if it's bad, it's me speaking. Hey, if it's good, then it's the company, then it's this organization, etc. You find a similar sort of situation as well in consultations. You could either be speaking as yourself, maybe you're representing or speaking on behalf of a collective, or maybe you're a member of a group and you're providing your perspectives in a group context. And so it is important to understand which portai or which hat you're wearing, and also think about the other portai or the other hats that you wear. And so with this example, we were thinking about how some people might have very strong kōrero and they might want it known to the world. Other people might have kōrero that they want to share, but they don't want people to know is attached to them. And so when we were looking at the consent forms, we were thinking about that particular dynamic when an individual shares something, but it also might have relevance to their hapu, their sub-tribe, or their iwi, their tribe. And so we were thinking about how should we do this? And we're like, well, why don't we just put it on the consent form and they can tick and say they agree for their information to be, you know, tied to them and shared in that way with the other collectives or the other groups. But the important thing was we gave them the choice to decide whether or not that was the case. So that's just 3 quick examples. I appreciate it was a whirlwind. So if you are wanting to look at where can you find more, I mentioned that last month we did do a social media campaign just to share some of our learnings from our 12 wānanga that we did. We each picked a topic that we wanted to cover. And in the bottom down the middle there, you can see that there is one around Māori data privacy, tikanga, collective privacy, and Māori data as well. So if you're wanting to learn more about Māori data and privacy, definitely recommend you have a look at that one. But there's so many elements of Māori data and Māori data sovereignty and Māori data governance as well. So if any of the other ones interest you, then feel free to have a look at those as well. But wanted to make sure that everyone also has a chance to ask questions as well. So I think I will wrap it up there. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Ernestynne. And thank you for that, because I think definitely those concrete examples help understanding Māori data sovereignty, which it's a lot to get our heads around. But this is an introduction, and I think that examples definitely help. And I'll probably, you know, we may not know a lot about the data sovereignty issues or the privacy issues for Māori, but I think we can see in some of those examples that, yeah, it's a big topic and it's only going to get bigger, I think. Yeah, we are on to question time now. So if you've still got questions, please just pop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I mean, I was gonna say, and I've got lots of questions myself, but I find it quite interesting about Māori data sovereignty because it's as we talked about it, I saw that the rights that Māori have in relation to our data is the same rangatiratanga that we have in relation to our whenua, or to our wai, or to our moana. They're all things that are we have rangatiratanga over, that we have mana over. And if that's the case, then we have rights and responsibilities in relation to those things. And data is no different. And it's just becoming more and more important as technology changes to try and make sure that that is protected and that that is discussed with us in relation to how our data is handled. So thank you for both, I think, illustrating that great example of how it's something that sounds a bit new, but it's actually not. Our people always, held control over their waiata, over their stories, over their reo, over their, so it's important that even today we exercise those rights. So I wanted to go on to some of the questions that we have here. We've got one from Ryan who's saying, regarding Māori data sovereignty, what about the data being held outside the individual or iwi controlled, which I think you touched on, Ernestynne, about collective, and individual. Did you want to say something more about that?
What about the data being held outside the individual iwi controlled app? So I guess that's probably a lot of data. I guess two big examples that come to mind is academia. They collect a lot in the researching space, and then the government as well, being a administration entity, I guess you could say, also hold a lot of Māori data as well. And I think through the mahi that we've been doing in the consulting space, what I'm finding is that Māori data sovereignty isn't just an iwi thing. It's not even just a public sector thing either. The private sector has been approaching us quite a bit for various projects. So I think the private sector's on board with this. Particularly they're saying, yep, we get it, te tiriti, but also, thinking about a lot of their customers, which also could whakapapa Māori. I think that really shows that Māori data is everywhere, and that people are starting to look at this, even NGOs as well. And we know that money's always tight for NGOs. I've also been seeing people making sure that they factor in Māori data sovereignty in that space as well. So not sure if I answered it, but it's definitely everywhere. And it's something that, regardless of whether you're for-profit, not-for-profit, public, private, academia, it's something that should be looked at.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the vast majority of Māori data is outside of Māori control at the moment, and that's why the work on governance is so important too. So you kind of think of governance here, and then so mana motuhi or sovereignty over here. Governance is where we need to work now because there's so much of it. In the meantime, we build capacity and capability and stuff over here in the mana motuhi space so that we can repatriate some of that data and get Māori data sovereignty in the future. So that's kind of how I think of it anyway.
I think that's a good point you make as well, Ernestynne, about it's not just iwi, because I think with settlements we've experienced, where your whānau or your hapu might have rights to a block of land, but it's actually been decided at an iwi level what's going to happen with that. And it's a tension that I think we need to try and fix. And the same thing is in relation to data. Is it something that's quite personal and quite individual, or is it something more collective? But I think where we need to work on is that collective space, because it's something, for instance, in relation to privacy, that is a bit of a struggle because it's so long been a very individual right that people had. Well, not our people, but other people. but it's something that for our people, we need to look at the collectives as well. So great. There's a question here from Hannah. What does it mean to decolonize data ecosystems?
I think you've literally written about that
Yeah,
as well, Chris.
I won't do a long answer here because there are papers and stuff on it. I think basically there's decolonizing algorithms and decolonizing data systems are kind of two sides of the same coin, because data drives algorithms and algorithms create data. But it's basically reframing the way you think of it. And in a really simplistic nutshell, flipping it on its head, rather than being an extractive process for which you derive value for yourself, it's more of a process where both the mana of the data and the mana of the things the data is about are being uplifted by what you do with the data. So if you were to have a decolonized data system, it would be one there that you wouldn't, something like that, you predicting SIF interventions and stuff wouldn't even be considered, because that's not uplifting the mana of the people involved or the data. It's trampling over both. So that's kind of really simplistically thing. But if you just Google decolonized data ecosystems, there's quite a bit of work out of First Nations in Canada. They have quite a bit more funding than us, so they're a bit ahead of us, which is good, really good for them. And they did provide quite a lot of help when we were working on the Māori Data Governance model. So yeah, really simplistic. Flip it from being extractive to something that is of benefit to all.
Ka pai. We got a question, can you have an example of the types of questions? Well, those are a couple of types of questions, but really there's anything in here. But actually, I've just looked in, there's lots. So we might have to, you know, keep it brief and quick, but thank you for all of your interest and your questions, and we'll do our best to get through what we can. I've got a question here. In a world where we manage our individual digital identity, each of us to manage our personal data, what open source technology do you know of being built to manage and govern our data in the complexity of multiple overlapping collectives? Whānau hapu, papa hapu, trusts, iwi. Māori data and privacy requirements are not homogeneous.
Yeah. Do you want to
I'm lost.
Okay,
There's so many
yeah, so many
questions,
questions.
and I answered one, and now.
Yeah, no. Answer 1 in 48. I know of some interesting projects. One is the Solid project, which is around essentially having, you can kind of choose who holds your data, and different organizations can hold different parts of it. So it was used, I think, and I'll probably get this wrong, but fact check me. I'm fairly sure it came out of the Nordic countries, but it may have been Estonia. And it's a way that you have more control of where your data is stored and who it's open to. But again, it's a really balancing between individual rights and collective responsibilities. So being a member of an iwi affords you some rights, but more than that, it affords you a lot of responsibility. And so that there's balancing your individual privacy rights with your collective responsibility to your iwi. You can't claim to be of your iwi without having those responsibilities to benefit to.
It's good. What I might do is, you need a bit of a scroll through the questions. Were there any that you particularly felt drawn to, Ernestynne?
I'm just trying to, because I know for a lot of people it's finding those roimi or resources, so I was just trying to quickly put those links in the chat for people. One that did pop up and I'm like, oh, should I, shouldn't I, is Te Tū Pai Ora.
Yeah, there's about 6 of those that come through now.
So,
I can start while you pop your links in. And
thank you.
So that's an interesting one. So you're probably all aware, so Te Tū Pai Ora and Microsoft put out a press release middle of last week around a change in the way Microsoft stored data, and that we're going to have some software that meant that the data stored in Azure would stay in Aotearoa. So one, they have to build their data centre, which doesn't exist yet, but they are in theory building it. When that did exist, they were going to have this thing that it stayed in Aotearoa. And so that's great in terms of one way. Now we've moved from 3 legal jurisdictions, Australia, US, New Zealand, to 2. So we've dropped Australia out of the mix of the legal jurisdictions. But unfortunately, due to the Cloud Act, and there's a King's Council legal opinion on this, and Buttle Finlay, the law firm, have written as well. The Cloud Act came about because Microsoft had data in Ireland and it didn't want to give it to the US government, and it said it's not stored under your jurisdiction, we don't have to. US government passed a law saying that yes, you do. If it's a US company, doesn't matter where you store the data, it's still under US legal jurisdiction. So while it's great in terms of it's better than having it under 3 legal jurisdictions, now it's under 2. So it's still not where it should be, but it's better than it was. I think it's probably the nicest way I can say it.
Great. There's a question here. I don't ask this because it's thought-provoking. Do you think legislation needs to change for privacy to be taken more seriously by government departments and entities? And it references recently communication that OPC made with the incoming minister. Probably what I just add there is I think OPC does have a view that there's always room for improvements, and it's suggesting that in relation to the recent biometrics consultation that is going on. So the Privacy Commission has some powers to create a code which helps to regulate these areas. So, that's an example of efforts to try and use its powers to improve, I suppose, privacy outcomes for Māori in relation to government agencies and other agencies. So, but, appreciate that there are some limitations on what's being done, but you're right, legislation is the way to make those changes subject to parliamentary will. Any other thoughts from you guys?
Not from me.
Okay. So yeah, as Ernestynne said, she's going to pop in the comments some resources, so feel free to go back and look at that and grab those done.
Sitting in the answered category, I'm just finding my way around Zoom, but yeah, definitely in the answered button area, you'll be able to find some links in there.
Curious about whether you collectively are seeing particular Māori data issues around the uptake of generative AI and similar tools.
So if you, the best way, I think, the best thing I can recommend to do, yes, I have, is the short answer, but Te Taka Keegan, who's a professor at Waikato University in the Computer Science Department, did a really good talk under the Kanapu project, so K-A-N-A-P-U. If you look in there around AI and specifically around large language models and stuff, some of the dangers are homogenization of our deal. So if you've got a large language model and a very small set of it as te reo, it's always going to get a bit mixed up. The generative stuff too, it actually does a surprisingly okay-ish job of creating te reo, but without the context or the understanding behind it, which you've always got to remember. It is creating a pattern from learned patterns, so it knows what words are most likely to go under what words. So it can create something that looks quite plausibly good, but without the mana or the context or even the understanding of it. So there is danger. On the plus side, there is Te Hiku Media, who are up in Kaitaia, who are doing fantastic work with AI, not so much around generative, but around language models and natural language processing that have allowed them to do amazing things of tagging thousands and thousands of hours of their audio archives with transcriptions and stuff that it wouldn't be humanly possible to be able to do. It's far easier for a human to QA it than to go through transcribing all that stuff. Did you have anything to add, Ernestynne?
He wairua pai, he wairua kino, ngā mea katoa. So, yeah, so I think tautoko i o whakaro. It's really interesting seeing the mix of things going on, particularly in the image generation space. So I know some people use it as a starting point and it speeds up doing mahi. Then we've got others who have decided to offer their services at a reduced cost because of how generative AI can assist in that space. But on the flip side of that, you've got the organisations, like you say, who take the data without the context and then commercialise it, etc. So I think, yeah, there's always good and bad with everything that comes out. So I think over time, yeah, we'll probably start to see some more, whether it's legislation, whether it's you know, some new codes coming out, because I think, yeah, it's definitely going to get bigger and bigger, particularly now that I'm starting to see videos reaching that first draft format where they actually look legit. So, you know, that's just going to open another can of worms again, seeing generated videos.
That's scary, It's deep fakes.
Yeah.
Well, kia ora tātou. Apologies, but I think we're going to have to draw to a close. Apologies about not being able to answer the sort of 100 questions that are here. But we'll try and add some comments in where we can to answer your queries. But thank you for joining us today. And thank you for your very positive comments as well. But I'd also like to thank our guests today, Ngā reira Tahu, Kāti Māmoe, Ngāti Porou, Whānau-a-Apanui. Tēnā kōrua e toha nei I o taonga ki te meninga e whakarongo mai nei. Kare toro ake ngā kōrero I tēnei wā, me motu tātou mā te karakia. So ka whakairia te tapu, kia wā te ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai, hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora.
Ki te.